The Inheritance of the Sorcerer. Kings is Past. Chapter 2. The Woman Without a Patron. I am Bryce Vare, keeper of the Quiet Archive, and this is Chapter 2, The Woman Without a Patron. Belgrave had survived its first night. The hospital stood. The sick were still being tended by the tired and the faithful, and those who were neither, but had simply not left. The gods had not returned. There would be no morning miracle, no amber light kindling warm between healers' palms, no quiet resolution of the crisis into the ordinary shapes that covenant doctrine preferred. But Belgrave endured, and the morning came gray and wet and full of the smell of rain on stone and lye soap, and old blood worked too deep into the white courtyard flags to come fully clean. I want to note something about this moment, because I think it matters. When institutions encounter something they cannot explain, their first instinct is rarely investigation. Their first instinct is narration. They reach for a story that places the inexplicable inside a framework they already control, because inexplicability is dangerous and frameworks are not. A god has withdrawn its attention because its faithful were impure. A miracle failed because the rite was performed incorrectly. A crisis occurred because someone, somewhere, made an error of faith or virtue, and the appropriate response is to identify that error and correct it, and then continue. But care that protects its own narrative before it protects the truth is also a kind of abandonment. On the morning after Belgrave's first divine silence, both of these things were simultaneously true. The Covenant's instinct toward narration was understandable, and it was going to make the crisis worse. Somewhere outside the town, in an abandoned building that she had found and chosen for its distance from the road and its good sightlines toward the main gate, a woman named Vaidra Elimbranth was holding a dark, cold, horn-like object in both hands and asking it to answer her. Neither party knew yet that they were already in conversation. The hospital floor had been scrubbed before dawn. A pair of junior healers, the same two who had been on the ward through the night, too tired to sleep and too anxious to rest, had taken to the task with a particular energy of people who need something to do with their hands. They had worked the stone methodically, section by section, with lye water and bristle brushes, and they had gotten most of it. But blood that has been walked through in crisis, blood that has been trodden into old stone flagging by a dozen sets of boots across a dozen hours, does not always come out. Some of it had gone too deep. The courtyard had a faint redness to it in certain lights, visible at an angle, invisible straight on, the kind of stain that announces itself without announcing its source. Elowen saw it as she crossed the courtyard at first light and did not remark on it. She had been a healer long enough to know that some residue outlasted the original wound. Kale was already in the outer ward, helping her sort the patients into categories that the previous evening's emergency had scrambled: those who needed sustained manual attention, those who were stable enough to be moved to the recovery room, those whose conditions had worsened overnight in the absence of divine stabilization and who now required reassessment. He moved through this work with the quiet efficiency she'd come to rely on without quite acknowledging. He asked the questions that needed asking, about pain, about water, about how long, and he recorded the answers in a ledger because no one had asked him to and someone needed to. They had not slept. "The family in the second bed," Sel said, not looking up. "The father has been asking since midnight whether anyone has sent word to the outer shrines, whether the silence is only in Belgrave or further." "What did you tell him?" "That I didn't know." "Which is true." Elowen glanced at the second bed, where a man in his middle years lay with one hand pressed over a rib injury that had not sealed overnight. He was watching them with the particular attention of someone who has heard his name said quietly and is trying to determine whether the conversation is about him. "Good answer," Elowen said. Mara arrived from the administrative wing as the morning bell rang. Weekly this time, pulled with obligation rather than ceremony, a single stroke where there should have been three. She carried a sheaf of reports that various priests and guards had submitted through the night. Her face held the expression KL had come to associate with her receiving more problems than solutions, a kind of determined composure that lived right at the edge of its own limits. "The divine silence is confirmed still active," she said, without preamble. No healing rites responding as of the 5th hour of morning. No successful prayers recorded anywhere in the hospital or in any of the 3 street shrines. Messengers sent to the 2 nearest Covenant outposts. No word back yet. "That will take days," Elowen said. "Yes." A priest, the same young man who had offered the theory of improper ritual form the previous day, a priest whose name was Edric, and who had spent the night convinced that if he could only find the precise theological error at the root of the silence, he could solve it by pure force of doctrinal understanding, came forward from near the ward entrance. He had the slightly luminous intensity of someone who has been awake for 20 hours, reaching a conclusion. "I believe I should address the patients and the staff," he said, "and any townspeople who have gathered outside. What has happened here is significant, and they deserve guidance. The gods do not withdraw their attention without purpose. This may be a test. It may be an invitation to deeper reflection. If we frame it correctly, Kale said without turning from the ledger, we tell them people are receiving manual care and we need clean bandages and more lye water, because that is what is actually true." Edric looked at him with the expression of someone who has discovered that a conversation will not be going where they expected. "The spiritual welfare of—" "Elowen," Kale finally turned. "Tell him!" Elowen set down the chart she was holding. She turned to Edric with the patience of someone who has explained things in bad circumstances so many times that the act of explaining has become a kind of protection. "Do not name this before we understand it," she said. "If you tell them the gods are testing Belgrave, every person in this building will begin searching for the sin that brought it about. They will find one. They will probably find several. People will be accused. The sick will blame themselves. The frightened will find someone to fear." She picked up the chart again. "The gods may or may not be testing Belgrave. I do not know. What I know is that the man in bed 2 has a rib injury that did not seal overnight and needs a proper binding before he breathes wrong and punctures something important. That is what I know. Attend to what you know." Edric absorbed this. He was young enough that it reached him. Then the temple guard appeared in the ward doorway. Not one of the administrative guards, but one of the lower temple's men, the ones assigned to the vaults and restricted halls beneath the main building. He was a compact man named Ferris, broad-faced and slightly out of breath, and the look on his face was the particular look of someone carrying news they did not want to have found. "Marshal Vey," he said, "the lower reliquary. The door is unsealed." Elowen stopped. Just for a moment, a half-second barely visible, her hands became still over the chart she was carrying. Then she continued reading. Mara was already moving toward the door. "I too." The lower reliquary was reached through a door behind the consecration chamber, down a stairway that had not been designed for regular traffic. The stairs were narrow, the ceiling low, the walls faced in the same dressed white stone as the temple above, but damp here with the subterranean cold, a fine crystalline moisture that had worked into the grouting over decades and left faint gray lines tracing the seams between blocks. Someone had left a lamp at the top of the stairs. It did not flicker. Mara went first, then Kael, then Elowen, and behind them the senior temple priest assigned to the reliquary records, a man named Ordas, who had held the post for 11 years, and who walked with the careful dignity of someone trying not to appear frightened. 3 guards followed. The bronze door at the base of the stairs stood open, not broken. This was the first thing Mara registered and noted, cataloging the scene with the methodical attention of someone trained to look before they conclude. The door had not been forced. Its lock, an old mechanism of cast brass in the shape of 2 interleaved lamp flames, showed no sign of damage. The hinges were undamaged. The door had simply been opened, in the way that doors are opened when someone has a key or an equivalent of one, and left ajar. Inside, the reliquary held 16 niches along 3 walls, each fitted with a small bronze door of its own, each labeled in the old temple script. Most were closed. Most appeared undisturbed. The room smelled of cold metal and sealed air. The particular deadness of a room designed to be forgotten between official visits. One niche was open. The niche was toward the back wall, in the upper row, and it was larger than most of the others. Its bronze door stood fully open, swung back on its hinges, and left there. The interior was empty, not cobwebbed empty, not dusty empty, but recently empty, the kind of absence that has a fresh quality to it, as though the air has not yet had time to settle back into the shape of what is no longer there. On the altar stone at the center of the room, a flat slab of pale limestone on a low plinth, used for the placement and preparation of objects during reliquary rites, there was a mark. It was roughly the size of a man's hand, possibly slightly larger. It had been made by heat, or by extreme cold, or by something that the stone could not categorize, and had simply recorded as best it could. It curved. It was dark, darker than scorch marks and cleaner than burn damage, in the shape of a hook or a horn, depending on the angle from which you viewed it. It had not been there the last time the lower reliquary had been officially visited, which Ordas confirmed was 8 days ago. Mara crouched beside the altar stone and studied the mark without touching it. What was in that niche? Orda stood in the doorway with his hands clasped before him in the attitude of someone who is deciding how much to say. The reliquary holds various historical objects. I know what a reliquary holds. What was in that niche, specifically? An object of historical significance, catalogued under the old Val Terrath survey records. It was not a sacred object in the active sense. Not a relic of miraculous property. He paused. Historical, ceremonial perhaps, archival. Aloan, who had moved to stand near the open niche, was reading the label on its bronze door. She read it twice. Then she said, without particular inflection, "Why is a harmless historical object stored under 3 separate seals in a restricted subterranean reliquary with a dedicated inventory record in the old temple script?" Ordes looked at her. "I have been a healer in this hospital for 19 years, she continued. "I have walked past this door approximately 4,000 times. I have never been told it existed." She turned from the niche. "That is not how historically insignificant objects are stored." The silence in the room had a quality to it that was distinct from the silence of the night before. That had been the absence of divine attention, wide and impersonal and terrifying in its scale. This silence was smaller and more specific, the silence of people deciding what they were and were not willing to say out loud. "We should speak with Ferris," Kyle said. He found the door. "He may have seen something." "Sir." They found Ferris in a small antechamber near the lower stair, sitting on a stone bench with his hands between his knees. He had the look of a man who has been sitting there for some time trying to decide whether what he was about to say would be believed. Mara sat across from him and took out a small ledger. She did this without ceremony, not as a threat, but as a signal that this was the kind of conversation that gets written down, which tends to clarify people's memories in useful ways. "Tell me what you saw." "From the beginning." Ferris took a breath. "I came on duty at the 3rd hour of night," he said. "Relieving Keld, he's the other lower guard." Keld said quiet, nothing unusual. Door was sealed when he checked it at midnight. "All right." "I did my first walk at the 4th hour." "The bronze door was sealed. I checked the lock, the way we're supposed to. Turn it, try the handle, confirm it holds. It held." "And at the 5th hour?" Ferris looked at his hands. "At the 5th hour, I was at the top of the stair." "Why?" A pause. "There was a woman at the top of the stair. Just standing there." Kyle, standing back against the wall in his usual position of unhelpful proximity, went still. Aloan, beside him, did not visibly react, which was its own kind of reaction. "Describe her," Mara said. "Older than me." "Older than you, Marshal, meaning no offense." Mara did not indicate offense or its absence. Well dressed, in an ordinary way. Nothing that announced wealth, nothing that announced poverty. Dark hair. She was very calm. He stopped. "Go on." "She had no weapon I could see." "No visible. There was nothing. No light on her hands, no working. The way warlocks sometimes carry themselves, there's something about them you can usually tell. She had none of that. She looked like a merchant's widow who had taken a wrong turning in the temple." "Did she have a key?" "I did not see one." "Then why did you let her pass?" Ferris looked up for the first time since beginning his account. He had the expression of a man who has been asking himself this question since approximately the 5th hour of the previous night. "She spoke to me." "What did she say?" He was quiet for a moment, as though reconstructing the words with care. "She asked me whether my God had ever answered me. Personally. Not through the hospital rites, or the temple lamps, or the collective prayers of a feast day. Just personally. Whether there had ever been a moment when I had prayed alone, in the dark, asking something for myself, and felt certain that someone was listening." The room was very quiet. "What did you answer?" Mara asked. "I didn't. I stood there while she walked past me and down the stair, and then I stood there for some time after that." He looked back at his hands. "She did not run. She did not hurry. She descended those stairs as though she had every right to, and when I came to myself enough to follow, the bronze door was already closed again. I thought the lock would hold against her. I thought she had simply gone down and come back up the other way, because there is no other way, and so when my relief arrived at dawn and reported the door standing open..." He stopped. "Did she enchant you?" Mara asked. "A glamour, a compulsion. Did you feel anything of that kind?" Ferris shook his head. "No. That's the part I keep coming back to. He looked up at Mara with the expression of a man who understands that what he is about to say does not improve his situation. No enchantment. No magic I could identify. Nothing but the question. He paused. She just made sense. That's the worst part. She asked whether the gods had ever answered me personally, and I stood there trying to remember whether they had, and I couldn't. I mean, I could think of the rites, I could think of the healings I'd witnessed, the whole of Belgrave that got saved from the plague 60 years back. But personally, in the dark, just me. He spread his hands. I stood there trying to remember, and she walked past me, and I let her. Mara wrote something in the ledger. Would you know her again? Yes. She turned 2 pages back, to a section she had prepared earlier that morning, a list of names drawn from the sealed Covenant incident records, cross-referenced with known patronless warlocks flagged for monitoring in the past decade. She turned the ledger toward Ferris and pointed at a name. He looked at it for a long moment. That could be her, he said. The description here, that could be her. The name was Vaidra Ilimbranth. Beside it, in the neat administrative shorthand of whoever had written the record, a notation, former warlock, patron severed or withdrawn under unclear circumstances, magic absent since, location unknown, considered non-threatening due to loss of capability. KL read the notation over Mara's shoulder. He did not say what he thought of it. He had learned that some observations, made aloud, made people defensive in ways that were not useful. IV. The administrative chamber was a room of whitewashed walls and practical furnishings, a long table, inkwells, sealing wax, the kind of chairs that suggest the room's primary function is recording rather than comfort. 3 senior priests were present when Mar brought Ordes and the reliquary records. 2 scribes had been summoned. The chamber smelled of parchment and the slightly sweet scent of warm wax. What followed was a process that KL recognized from earlier in life, from watching other institutions in other crises manage the problem of what to write down. He had not always been in Belgrave. He had lived in enough places to know how this went. The Covenant would send word to Caer Thalor. This was not optional, the protocols required it, and Mara was senior enough to ensure that it happened correctly. The question was what that word would say. 2 letters were drafted. The first was for general distribution, to the local lords, to the town magistrate, to the priests at the nearest outpost shrines, and to whatever members of the public would eventually ask what had happened and why. It was a careful letter. It described the hospital's current situation in terms of challenges requiring additional resource and support. It mentioned prayers requiring reinforcement. It mentioned the Covenant's concern for Belgrave's welfare. It did not use the word silence. It described the reliquary breach as a security matter under investigation. It did not describe the breach's connection to anything else, because no connection had been officially established. The second letter was sealed, addressed only to the High Prelate's office in Caer Thalor, and was considerably shorter. It used the word silence. It used the phrase reliquary breach. It mentioned Vaidra Ilimbranth. It mentioned the possibility of heretical object theft, and noted the name was flagged in existing records. Kael watched both letters being prepared with the attention of someone who is memorizing a thing without appearing to memorize it. Which letter tells them people died? He said, when the first draft of the public letter was read aloud for approval. The room became briefly uncomfortable. One of the scribes looked up. The letters are addressed to different concerns, said the senior priest overseeing the drafting, a man named Brother Laeth, who had come from the administrative wing and had not been in the hospital during the night. The first is a communication to local authorities about resource allocation. 3 people died last night, Kyle said. They died of conditions that would have been treated by divine healing under normal circumstances and were not treated because normal circumstances did not obtain. That is a fact. There is no letter here that contains it. Mara, seated at the end of the table, was looking at the middle distance with the expression she used when she agreed with something she could not publicly agree with. The pastoral concern for the deceased will be, began Brother Laeth. I am not asking about pastoral concern, Kell said. He kept his voice even. He was, in general, a man who kept his voice even. It was something he had learned to do at cost, and he deployed it now with the particular precision of someone who knows that anger is more effective when it is measured. I am asking which of these letters tells the people who make decisions in Caer Thalor that the absence of divine healing in Belgrave has already resulted in preventable deaths, and that the number will increase if assistance is not prioritized above message management. The room was quiet again. Mara said, without looking up from the table, It will be addressed in the sealed communication. In what terms? A pause. Inappropriate terms. Elowen, who had come in late and sat in the corner without taking a chair, said, "A lie written cleanly is still infection. It spreads through the same channels. It produces the same results." She said this without accusation, in the same matter-of-fact tone she used to deliver medical prognoses. "I am not accusing anyone here of malice. I am noting that a covenant communication that frames 3 deaths as a resource allocation concern will produce a resource allocation response, and a resource allocation response is not what is needed." Brother Leith looked at her. He was a man who believed in process, not because he was a coward, but because he had seen process fail less often than intuition. "Sister Elowen, the channel of communication between Belgrave and Caerthalar passes through." "I know the channel," Elowen said. "I have been trying to use it for 19 years. This landed differently than she had intended, perhaps, or exactly as she had intended. Either way, it stopped the conversation for a moment." Mara looked at her, then at Kael, then back at the letter. Something passed across her face that was not quite doubt. Mara was not a woman who permitted herself doubt in administrative chambers, but was adjacent to it. She was intelligent enough to hear what was being said beneath the exchange, which was not about letter drafts at all, but about the institutional habit of shaping truth into a form that institutions found manageable. She was also loyal enough to the covenant to believe, still, that the channel could be trusted to produce appropriate responses if appropriately prompted. She was beginning to understand that these two beliefs might not be compatible. The sealed letter was completed. It named Vedra Ilimbranth. It was sealed with the red wax of official covenant correspondence and handed to the fastest rider in the temple stable, who departed at midday in the rain, heading south toward the Caerthalar road. She had found the building 3 weeks before Belgrave. It was not much of a building. Once it had been a way station, perhaps, or a prayer keep for travelers on the old northern road. One of those small, functional structures the Covenant had maintained along pilgrimage routes until the routes were rerouted and the structures were simply left, slowly collaborating with the weather. The roof held in most places. The floor was stone. The single window that had once held oiled parchment was open to the air now, which meant the wind came through at night, but it also meant she could see the road from the east-facing wall, and see the temple spire of Belgrave above the tree line to the north, which she had found useful. Vaedra Ilimbrandt sat on the floor in the center of the empty room with the object in her lap and looked at it. She had unwrapped it twice already that morning. The first time, she had set it on the stone floor and stepped back and studied it from a distance. The way you study something you are not yet certain is safe to touch. The second time, she had picked it up and turned it in her hands, slowly, examining the veining of pale gold along the black dark surface with the careful attention of a scholar and the controlled expression of someone who has forbidden themselves the luxury of hope. It was shaped like a horn or a finale, like the uppermost projection of something that had once been larger and more significant, broken free of its context and rendered, in isolation, both less legible and somehow more concentrated. The way a single word lifted from a sentence can seem to mean more than it did in place. It was heavier than it looked. It was cold in a way that was not simply the cold of stone or metal on a winter morning, though perhaps it was only that, the cold of an object that had been sealed in an underground room for a very long time and had taken on the temperature of its confinement. She tried to make it do something. This was the part she had been postponing. She had been postponing it since the night she walked out of the temple with it, through the silence of a building full of guards who were, each of them, too occupied with their own private doubts to see clearly. She had been postponing it because she understood, with the precise self-knowledge of someone who has already lost a great deal, that if she tried and failed again, she would have to decide what to do with that failure. For 4 years, she had tried other things and failed in other ways. She had tried the mediation houses, where patronless warlocks sometimes found new arrangements, paid contracts with lesser powers, careful agreements that did not promise the particular intimacy of the relationship she had lost but provided function. She had tried. 3 times she had begun such negotiations, and each time the mediating power had assessed her and declined, and the declines had shared a quality she could not name but recognized. Not dismissal exactly, but the specific discomfort of a party who has received private information about a prospective partner and decided the situation is not clean. She did not know what information. She did not know why she was considered unclean. She had tried the scholarly recovery, the long, careful study of contract law, of patron structures, of the mechanisms by which warlocks who lost their patrons sometimes recovered magic through accumulated understanding. The scholars were polite. The books were thorough. The conclusion was consistent. Her kind of loss, total and inexplicable and accompanied by no patron communication of any kind, was technically unprecedented. The literature contained nothing useful. What she had not allowed herself to do in any of this was to grieve. Grief required you to accept that the thing was gone. She was not ready to accept that the thing was gone. It had not been gone. It had stopped. There was a difference between gone and stopped. A fire that has been extinguished is different from a fire that is banked and waiting. A patron that had answered her consistently, intimately, for 11 years, that had been present in ways she could feel along the nerve length of her entire self, a presence like warmth on the back of the neck, like a second breath behind her own. That kind of patron did not simply stop. Not without word, not without reason, not without so much as the courtesy of an ending. She had stopped, and then the world had stopped caring whether she could explain it. She spoke the old command forms, the ones she had used 1,000 times when her patron's power had been a thing she could call, and it would come. She spoke them correctly. She spoke them with the same precision she had given everything in her life since the silence began. The precision of someone who believes the problem is technical rather than absolute, and is working backward through every variable to find the error. The object in her hands remained cold. The pale gold veining did not kindle. Nothing happened that she could name or measure. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the east-facing window, the sky was a uniform gray, and the tree line stood against it in dark vertical lines, and above the trees the tip of Belgrave's temple spire was visible, the lamp at its apex burning even in daylight, burning as it had burned for 70 years, because that lamp was not a healing rite, and was not subject to whatever failure had overtaken the rest. She understood, intellectually, that she did not know what she had stolen. That was the honest thing, and she was, when she was alone, capable of honesty. She had found the object in the reliquary record through 2 years of careful archival work, cross-referencing Vault Harith survey entries against Covenant reliquary catalogs, tracing object descriptions across institutional reorganizations, following the thread of a thing that had been moved and renamed and classified and reclassified with the particular institutional anxiety of someone who does not want to explain what they have or why they have it. She had found it described in 3 separate documents in 3 different ways, and none of the descriptions had fully matched the others, and the most recent description had called it simply an ornamental ceremonial piece of possible historical interest, and she had thought, then no one will miss it. What she had suspected and not confirmed and was trying now to either confirm or rule out was that the object was a piece of something larger, something that had once been assembled and then deliberately and carefully disassembled. She had a theory about what that larger thing had been. She was not yet certain enough in the theory to name it to herself, because naming things made them real, and real things could be taken, and she had lost enough real things. The lamp above the temple continued burning. The trees continued in their dark straight lines against the gray. She sat in the cold room and held the cold object and did not permit herself to be disappointed, because she had not yet been promised anything. "Answer me," she said. "Not a command, not a prayer. Something between the way you speak when you are calling to someone in a building you are not certain they are still in, trying to reach them without admitting the possibility that they may already be gone." Far away, in the town, she could see the spire of above the tree line, the single bell that had been ringing at irregular intervals through the night. Not the main hospital bell, but a smaller one, a neighborhood bell in the East Quarter that had been going since the crisis began, pulled by a woman whose daughter was still in the ward and who had decided that motion was better than stillness. That bell went quiet. The timing was coincidence. It had to be coincidence. The woman had simply tired, or gone back inside, or been called away. That was all. Vedra looked at the object in her hands. She had not made the bell stop. She did not know that the bell had stopped. She could not hear it from this distance. What she could hear was the silence in the room with her, which had not changed, and the wind through the window, which had not changed, and the very small, impossible thing that had shifted in the quality of her own waiting, which she could not name and could not prove, and was not willing to examine too closely in case it dissolved under examination. She allowed herself, very carefully, to take it as a sign, not because she was certain. She was not certain. She was a woman who had spent 4 years not being certain of anything, and she knew, with the specific clarity that comes from practicing deprivation, exactly what certainty felt like, and exactly what it felt like to need certainty badly enough that you would accept substitutes. She knew she was accepting a substitute. She was doing it with full awareness and no apology, because the alternative was the thing she had not allowed herself yet, the grief and the admission and the radical restructuring of everything she understood about herself, and she was not ready for that yet. It would have to be enough. She wrapped the object in the cloth she had brought for it, dark wool folded 3 times, and set it in the interior pocket of her coat, next to her chest, where it sat cold and heavy against her sternum. She stood. She looked out the east window for a long moment at the town she had left an hour before it became a crisis, and would leave again before the crisis was named. There were things she needed to understand better. There were records she needed to find. There were people she needed to be in conversation with, none of whom knew she existed yet, none of whom would choose the conversation willingly if they knew what it would cost them. But that came later. All of it came later. For now, she had a cold object in the pocket of her coat and the memory of a bell stopping and the particular posture of a woman who has decided, against the evidence, to continue. VIS. In Belgrave, the afternoon drew toward evening without resolution. The hospital worked. Eloin taught 2 more priests, the principles of wound binding without divine assistance, the direct pressure, the angle, the patience required when you cannot simply ask for the bleeding to stop and have it stop. Mara organized a coordination meeting with the magistrate's office, and it was practical and efficient and accomplished several things, none of them the thing most needed. Cale went back to sorting bandages, because bandages needed sorting, and because sorting bandages was the most honest contribution he could currently make to a situation that was honest in its crisis and dishonest in its management. The messenger on the bay horse was 3 hours south of Belgrave by nightfall, carrying a sealed letter that would arrive, and be received, and be filed. This is not a condemnation of the messenger, who rode through cold rain with professional commitment and arrived safely. In an abandoned way station north of the Pilgrim Road, a patronless warlock sat with a cold relic pressed against her sternum and made plans. And, in the quiet archive of Letharam, which I will introduce to you in its proper time, a record-keeper who believed himself to be a neutral party, sat in the high room above a cold sea, and wrote nothing, and said nothing, and by doing so made his own kind of contribution to what came next. I mention myself here with that particular pride. The silence in Belgrave continued. It would continue through the night and into the following morning and into the days after that, and the people in its midst would continue to live inside it with the particular quality of endurance that ordinary people display when confronted with extraordinary failures, not heroically, not badly, but with the stubborn, imperfect humanity of those who have no other option. Eloin would keep working. Mara would keep trying to serve 2 things at once. Kael would keep staying. And somewhere beyond all of them, in the administrative machinery of the Covenant and the cold calculations of a woman who needed the world to have answered her, the next chapter was already being written.